Hi, my name's Aisha Formanski and I'm here with BGcation.com today to show you my favorite method of stamping, which is also a method that I wrote a book about. I call it punch metal jewelry. Punch metal jewelry is a technique where you use design stamps to create repetitive all-over patterning. Now, I came up with this design a while ago when I wanted to do this and I didn't have a rolling mill. So what I did was I used graph paper and created all these what I think are really cool patterns that are actually in the back of my book. But today I'm going to show you how to use graph paper to build your own custom design. So let's get started. Here are the tools and materials we're using in today's class. Bench block, sandbag, 1-pound brass mallet, plastic mallet, and a variety of design stamps. Let's talk a little bit about which design stamps I prefer for this technique. I like small, little detailed stamps, like these, the asterisk, the period, the 3-bubble set, and other small little design stamps like the flower and the star. Here are more tools we'll be using: metal shear, chain nose plier, hole punch plier, medium grit file, extra fine steel wool, fine point permanent marker, a larger permanent marker for darkening your impressions, scissors, graph paper, this is 10 by 10 squares within 1 inch, glue stick, and plastic templates. When making punch metal jewelry, you can use sheet metal or blanks. In today's class, we're making earrings, so you may want some ear wires. This technique offers a lot of different design options, as you can see here. I tend to stamp a large piece of sheet metal and then fabricate my pieces from that large sheet metal, as you can see here. But you can also use blanks, which is really, really handy. Also, take into consideration when you're looking here, you can do really simple things like this sample here, which is just using the 4-cross stamp and the period stamp and stamping each intersection of the graph paper. So that's pretty simple. These ones here are a little bit more elaborate, and we're gonna go over how you can do that on your own. And then I love this little chevron one, because why not? Just one stamp, stamping it all over, and it creates a great texture. In my book, there are 8 patterns plus 1 graph paper for you to photocopy and use yourself. Of course, you don't have to use my patterns in the book or my specific graph paper. You can find this readily on the internet and at basic stores. This is 10 by 10. So it's 10 little blocks by 10 little blocks in 1 inch. And I find that this is a great size because it's so small and our design stamps are super small, so it allows for a lot of different design options in different quadrants. So we're going to use this today to teach you how to create your own pattern. So let's adhere it to our sheet metal. Now what I do is I take a glue stick. I use an extra strength glue stick. And I apply the adhesive to the sheet metal. And you're gonna wanna be kind of liberal with your application, because if you don't have enough glue on here while you're working, your paper will start to peel up. And we really want it to stay adhered the whole time we're working. You can also use rubber cement. It works great. I find that glue sticks are more readily available around the house. So there we go. You can see how much glue is on here. Now what I do is I place my graph paper face down and press my metal on. And let's trim off the excess here. And then I really burnish this down with my fingers. No air bubbles, pretty smooth. And then trim your excess. All right, now we're ready to punch. For the piece that we're going to make in today's class, I'm going to use these two stamps, which are two of my favorites, the period stamp and the cross star stamp. We're going to start with the period. And let's talk a little bit about where I'm going to start and why. I like to start by sectioning off a square within the grid. So for an example, I am going to section off a square that is 4 squares, like in here. So it's a square that's 2 by 2. And I'm going to strike each corner of that square. So let's start with that. As you can see, I've just started establishing my pattern, so I'm going to keep working, striking at each of those corners for the whole little piece of sheet metal here. All right, I have completed the period stamp, striking the corner of each 2 by 2 square here. And let me show you a little trick. Sometimes my eyes play little tricks on me. They're not as good as they used to be. And I can't tell if I have completed. So what you do is you flip it over and you just take a peek. Just look around. And sometimes if you've forgotten one, it'll be really obvious and then you can go back in and strike that intersection. All right, so now I'm going to add the cross star stamp. And I took a look at this and I've decided that I think it'll look best to place this little cross star right in the middle of the 2 by 2 square. So let's do that now. As you can see, I'm being pretty particular about the placement of my stamp. This stamping technique has a lot of structure. It's very uniform. Some may say it's maybe a little inattentive, but I think that that's why it is so beautiful, is because the patterning creates this really repetitive, very uniform stamping. We'll keep stamping here. You may notice that when I was stamping the period stamp, I was just striking it once. It's because the period stamp is really just like a teeny spear and you don't need that much oomph behind your blow to get a nice impression. Whereas with the cross star, there's more design, so we're dispersing more metal. So I'm striking it twice. You might even need to strike it 3 times, depending on your strength and your hammer. All right, this is the perfect time also to show you. See how it's starting to warp? Now, I usually let this go for a while until it gets in the way, but once it starts to warp, what I like to do is flip it over and take a plastic mallet and give it a few nice whacks. That just flattens it back out and makes it easy to continue stamping. So I'm going to keep going off camera and fill the rest of the 2 by 2 squares. Here I have the piece all finished. I've added the cross star in all the little 2 by 2 squares. I think it looks pretty good. Now you could add more designs if you wanted. You could add, a little burst where the cross star meets the dot. You could do all kinds of things. But I'm just gonna keep it kind of simple. I think it's nice. So I'm gonna remove the paper template off the sheet metal, and how I'm gonna do that is I'm gonna take it to the sink and put some warm water on and just rub it with my fingers, and then I'm gonna brush it with a used toothbrush. And the reason I'm doing that is because every time we strike to create our impression, we're actually pushing the paper down deep into the impression. And those little fine bristles on the toothbrush will just clean it up and pop them off. Also, when I get back, we can talk about this little edge and how to clean that up, because if you're gonna do this technique on a blank, this is gonna happen quite a bit. So let's remember to come back and talk about that. All right, see you soon. Here's that blown out edge that I was telling you about. So you can see the design stamp forced the metal out past the edge. So if you're using a blank and you want to keep that defined edge of the piece, you're going to want to make sure to file this. File all that away, maybe even follow up with a little sandpaper to smooth it out. Here is the finished sheet metal. I think it turned out pretty cute. Looks good. Let's talk about designing with this sheet. Now, we have been looking at it as a square, right? Because I kept talking about a 2x2 square. But the reality is when you start designing, you can cut out shapes with a lot of different methods. You can use templates like we have here. But you can also just trace things. You know, you could trace the bottom of a small little jar for a circle, really just kind of look around your house and try to find some interesting shapes. The end of a lipstick sometimes is a really nice rounded square. We're gonna use a template. So let me show you here how you can look at the pattern in a different way. Let's start with this square. So I can trace the square onto the sheet metal and then cut it out with shears. So this way I see it as kind of right angles, but maybe what I want to do is turn it and have it come diagonal like that for more interest. Maybe I want to use the teardrop, and I can have it square starting with the period stamp at the very tip, or I can pivot and have the cross stars coming across diagonally. So this is another way for you to expand on your design. I'm going to make a pair of earrings using the teardrop shape. And my fine tip Sharpie marker here, just trace this. I also tend to make sure that I'm using the smallest amount of metal so that if there's any remaining, I can use it for another project. So let's actually flip this. See if I can get another one out of this corner. Then with the shears, I'm going to simply cut out the shapes. Sometimes when you cut with shears, getting around small areas is a little difficult. So getting around this little tip sometimes, you're going to pivot quickly. And then the straightaways are the easiest parts. Of course, if you have a more complicated design, you may consider sawing, which is one of my favorite things to do. I teach a class here at Beachucation on sawing, if you're not familiar. Here are the two little teardrops. Now they don't look so pretty yet, right? They're kind of rough around the edges and we can still see the Sharpie. So let's refine these a little bit. Bring the bench block back into play here. These got a little warped while cutting them with the shear, so I'm going to give them a couple smacks. And let's remove the Sharpie marker. This is very fine steel wool. It's 0000 steel wool, which I find very handy for cleaning things up or giving them a rough little organic finish. The edges got kind of wonky when I was cutting these shapes out with the shear, so let's refine these even more using a file. I like to flip it over and look at the shape from the back side so I'm not distracted by the pattern. So here we can see that we've got a lump. With filing, the way I say it is I file on the push. Some people say that you start from the tip and work down. That's so the grit is actually working. If you go back and forth, you're just kind of dulling your file. It's not the worst thing to do, but you might want to get in the habit of just filing on the push. So that's getting better. Just continue all the way around, smoothing out any lumps and bumps. You may want to darken the impressions. For example, on this pendant, darkening them really makes the design pop. You can also just leave it blank or naked like this. My ring has no darkening in the impressions. But let's do it just for an example's sake. So sometimes we like to do what we call the quick and dirty method here at Beachucation of darkening impressions, which is to use a Sharpie marker. And you just simply draw all over the blank, filling all of those impressions with ink. It's a little messy, but it's okay. Of course, you can also use liver of sulfur, black max, depending, or hydrochloric acid, depending on what material you're using. There's also a lot of other really fun colored patinas out there that would look great on this technique. Make sure to get that ink deep in those impressions. The period stamp's hard to fill in sometimes. All right, I think I filled everything. Let it dry for a second. You don't want to touch a pro polish pad to this if the ink is wet or even the steel wool. Everything will just stick to it. Looks pretty good. Bring that steel wool back in and simply just rub the excess away. We're going to pop a hole in the top for our ear wire because we're making earrings. This is our handy dandy hole punch plier. What I like to do is place the pin on the piece and then I take a look and make sure it's in the center and exactly where I want it. That looks pretty good. And then squeeze. And then simply we're just going to add the ear wire. So we have these simple little ear wires and you just take your chain nose plier and just very gently pivot the loop open. And I just open them just enough to slide the piece on. Take the ear wire, thread it through the front. Grab that chain nose pliers again and pivot it back. And of course you do the same thing on the second piece there so that you have a matching set, and you have these cute little earrings using the punch metal technique. I think they turned out pretty great. Here are some finished pieces of jewelry I made with punched metal sheet. Here I have a charm bracelet. This is actually in my book, where I made 3 different charms out of 3 different metals and 3 different patterns. I think it creates a nice contrast with one another. Here's the ring I was wearing earlier. I love that. It's the only piece that I actually wear daily that doesn't have the impressions darkened. I really like how it looks. And then these 2 here with the copper. I want to talk about this one a little bit. See how the top of the circle is cut off? Well, this happens sometimes when you're doing punched metal jewelry. Let's take a look here. Can you see how there's a bite out of the top like that? And this is because when you use a blank and sharp stamps like the slash and the parenthesis, sometimes when intersections meet, you can actually create a weak section in the blank and it will pop off. So just make that a happy accident like I did here, and come up with a creative way to make something else look beautiful out of it. If you'd like to replicate these pieces, I was going to point out that this piece is riveted. There are 3 little rivets right there. Those are the Beaducation nail head rivets. And those are the same things used here on the leather bracelet, but the ring has been soldered. These beautiful earrings were made by Taryn McCabe here at beaducation.com. She's on the design team. She's very, very talented. She made these after reading my book, and I love her interpretation of how to do repetitive pattern, but using a very detailed design stamp. While we're talking about design ideas and design options, I wanted to show you some other sheet metal that I stamped. These 4 designs are very different from one another, but it's using the same technique. So the first one here on the right is using the graph paper and expanding your design further than the 2x2 square that we previously used. This one here I called a peacock design because it has these nice arches. That pattern's from my book. And then these 2 are simply using the graph paper and striking at each intersection of the graph paper, but with different design stamps to create a different look. So the options are endless. Thanks so much for taking my class. I hope you had a really good time. And remember, if you want a few more patterns, there are 8 in the back of my book. And it also comes along with 20 fun projects. So I hope you'll take a look, and we look forward to seeing you again here at beaducation.com.